Hello and welcome back to the second lecture in our series on the historical memory of the Asia-Pacific War in Japan, East Asia, and the United States. And in the last lecture, we looked at a little bit at what historical memory is and how it is formed. And today, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the background to the Asia-Pacific War, and then we're going to touch on some of its causes. And in terms of the causes, mainly we're going to be focused on internal causes to Japan. um, and I hope that this lecture will provide us with the requisite background knowledge, just a baseline of knowledge that we're going to need as we move forward in this class and try to understand why some of these events happened and why people responded to them the ways that they did. In today's lecture, it's just going to be a very general outline. I'm not going to go into too much detail of the events covered here. We're going to save that for future classes. Okay, so let's get started. So the Asia-Pacific War, 1931 to 1945, causes and background. I want to start in the early 19th century and really get to the beginnings of modern Japanese history and what can be called the growth of a proto-nationalist movement in response to the incursion of foreign ships, mainly Russian, English, and American, into Japanese waters. And this really flummoxed the Tokugawa Bakufu. They didn't know how to respond to these ships, eventually reacted by just closing themselves off to foreign interaction even more. But internally in Japan, this prompted a kind of self-reflection about, who are we as a people and how do we want to project ourselves as a country to the outside world. And some thinkers like Hirata Atsutane, for example, with the Kokugaku school and the Mito school, started to argue for an emperor-centered vision of a united Japan. And so this is kind of the emergence then of an early Japanese nationalism from around the mid 19th century. And this, of course, then relates to that. In 1853 and 4, a U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa, forcing Japan to open itself up to trade with the United States. But it was a very one-sided agreement. Basically, the United States did not look at Japan as a quote, civilized country at this time because it didn't have a modern constitution, for instance. And so this was the start of a series of unequal treaties that Japan then later signed with other Western countries, agreeing to trade with them at basically an unbalance and not in the favor of Japan at that time. And then this set off a series of events that in 1868 led to samurai loyalists, and loyalist here, loyal means to the emperor, to launch the overthrow of the Tokugawa government. And this is referred to as a restoration of imperial power, in Japanese Isshin. And these mid-ranking samurai led the revolt against the Tokugawa Bakufu and held up, at that time, only 16-year-old Emperor Mutsuhito as the new kind of figurehead and center of what would become then the modern Japanese nation state. Now, it's also important to emphasize that at this time, this new state, then the new Meiji state, began to also fortify its borders. And it incorporated then, in the process of doing that, Ezochi, which today is known as Hokkaido Prefecture, into Japan. And this used to be a kind of a separate autonomous region with different groups of peoples there living there, most notably the Ainu people, who were a different ethnicity from people in Japan. Similarly, in 1872, the Meiji government abolished the Ryukyu kingdom. This also was an independent kingdom who had hundreds of years of history and diplomatic relationships with various foreign states around Asia, China and Japan included. But the Meiji government forcefully abolished the Ryukyu kingdom, carried off, forcefully abducted the Ryukyuan king Shoutai, and imprisoned him in Tokyo, and then made that into Okinawa Prefecture and stationed troops there to keep the peace for quite a while. In 1873, the government enacted universal conscription and began to develop, was already in the process of developing a modern army under the head of the army at that time led by Yamagata Aritomo. In 1879, the Yasukuni Shrine was established, and this was originally established to honor the loyalist forces, Isshin forces who had fought against the Tokugawa government in the Boshin War in 1868. And the Yasukuni Shrine was unique, and it remains unique to this day, and also quite problematic in many respects as well, in that it only, initially, it only honored the Isshin forces, and it did not honor those who fought on the side of the Tokugawa Bakufu. And this was quite different, actually, than typical wartime memorialization throughout Japanese history. For most of Japanese history, in fact, after a battle, the victorious side would perform religious services to pacify the spirits of the dead of the opposing side, so that they didn't come back and haunt them in the afterlife. But Yasukuni completely ignored that long history, only honoring these loyalist forces, only honoring their side, essentially, and excluding everyone else. And another unique point about Yasukuni Shrine was that it honored the military dead as war gods, and eventually this term Eire was developed to describe this. And this as well remains quite problematic today as we consider memories of the Asia-Pacific War, and as Yasukuni Shrine honors the Japanese military dead. In 1882, the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, Gunjin Chokuyu, was issued, and this emphasized basically loyalty to the emperor, extreme loyalty to the emperor. It depicted the emperor and soldiers as forming part of the same body, with the emperor as head and the soldiers as the limbs and appendages, the arms and legs, who were expendable, of course, in that metaphor, and should sacrifice themselves, if need be, to save the head, the figurehead, the emperor. In 1885, Fukuzawa Yukichi wrote Datsuadon, translated as Goodbye Asia. And I highlight this because this is just an example of many popular attitudes at the time that were very disparaging of so-called Asian and especially Chinese culture. Up until this point in Japanese history, culture in Japan had been very Sinocentric. and much of Japanese culture had been inherited from China and Korea. But during the Meiji period, many in Japan started to see China and Korea as being backwards, as being less developed in comparison with Western countries. And many in Japan thought that if they were to develop and modernize, they would need to follow this Western model and abandon um, the Sinocentric model. But what this resulted in as well, of course, is a lot of discrimination, racial discrimination against Chinese and other East Asians. And this is very evident in this writing. In 1889, the Meiji Constitution was issued. This emphasized the emperor, described him as sacred, and it also positioned him as head of the military. And sacred here meaning descended from the gods, drawing from Shinto religious mythologies and the idea of the imperial lineage being descended from Amaterasu. In 1890, the imperial rescript on education, Kyoiku ni Kansuru Chokugo, was issued. This as well emphasized loyalty to the emperor, as well as the idea of a family state, kazoku kokka, wherein the citizens, or shinmin at this time, so subjects of the Japanese Empire, were described as children in the family, and the emperor was described as the father. So drawing from Confucian philosophy as well, in this metaphor, the children were expected to illustrate filial piety to this father figure, to the emperor. In 1894 and 5, Japan fought the Sino-Japanese War with China, and at this time also witnessed in popular Japanese culture a birth of Japanese nationalism. Now, I'm showing a picture here that illustrates a scene from the Sino-Japanese War, and it is quite gruesome and perhaps a bit shocking. But I want to just point out some things here, because I think this illustrates many of the changes, for better or for worse, that were taking place in Japanese society, and especially regarding the military and Japan's foreign policy at this time. And this is from, by the way, MIT's fantastic online database, Visualizing Cultures. And the title of this up here it says, Nihon Banzai, Pyongyang no Gaisen. And in English, this would translate as, well, Banzai Japan. Banzai, of course, meaning something like long live the emperor, or may the emperor's reign be long, something like this. Pyongyang, of course, the city now in North Korea, and Gaisen meaning the triumphant return of the troops. So this would be after a battle in Pyongyang. And we see here the Japanese soldiers celebrating in victory, and notably standing upon a pile of slain Chinese soldiers. So this contrast between the celebrating troops, stepping on the bodies of Chinese soldiers is quite stark, for one. And then another thing to point out are also, for instance, the modern uniforms of the Japanese troops in comparison to the not so modern, the kind of more traditional clothing worn by the Chinese side. And this image itself is meant to give the impression of Japanese strength, superiority, and also the Japanese side as being more modern and developed than the Chinese side, which also, in addition to having more traditional clothing, uses just kind of traditional swords, for instance, and halberds, etc. So this image, I think, kind of serves as an an apt, perhaps, metaphor for the progression that Japanese militarism and Japan's foreign policy would take until 1945. Okay, going into then the 1900s, 1904 to 1905, Japan fought the Russo-Japanese War over colonial control in Korea. Japan was victorious in the war. Their victory over Russia, which was considered a modern, basically Western power at that time, shocked much of the world. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea. During World War I, Japan did not play such a prominent role, but it did use this as an opportunity, essentially, to attack and try to take German possessions in China and also in other places in the Asia-Pacific as well. But notably in China, in Shandong province, in Qingdao as well. And in 1915, also during World War I, Japan issued the 21 demands to the Qing government. And this was an attempt to exercise colonial control in China, basically demanding that the Qing government accept Japanese military and political advisors to exercise power and influence over the political process there. After World War I, then, in 1917, the Russian Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, occurred, and this prompted a backlash against kind of the rise of communism, Russian communism, and Japan, along with some Western nations, sent troops, dispatched troops to fight the Russian Bolsheviks. This was known as the Siberian Intervention. Japan actually sent many more troops than the Western countries had initially asked for. It sent 70,000 troops and stayed in Russia much longer than anticipated. And so clearly trying to exercise geopolitical control as well in East Asia and to assert dominance there. In 1919, Japan sent troops to suppress Chinese and Korean independence and anti-colonial movements. So Japan was really, although it itself, just a few decades earlier, had gone through the process of developing a modern nation state, it essentially tried to deny the same right to its East Asian neighbors and deny them the ability to go through this process in order that it could step in as the new colonial power there. And there's a large crackdown on left-wing thought throughout this time. The Japan Communist Party was outlawed as soon as it was formed in 1922. But left-wing thought and Marxist thought in general were policed and suppressed throughout this period in Japan, as emphasized by the 1925 Peace Preservation Law, Chian Ijiho, which made it a crime punishable by large fines and imprisonment to criticize the emperor system and to espouse left-wing ideas, such as the abolition of private property, for instance. In 1928, the Kwantung Army, this in Japanese would be Kanto-gun, assassinated Zhang Zuolin, head of Manchuria. So already at this time, the Kwantung Army is in the Liaotong Peninsula, which it inherited after the Russo-Japanese War, but it's also controlling the South Manchurian Railway throughout many parts of northern China and Manchuria, and the military starts to then see Manchuria as an essential part of Japanese territory, a territory that they had purchased through the blood sacrifices of earlier wars, and started to see it as essential for maintaining their control and protecting Korea as well. So in 1931, the Kwantung Army attacked Chinese forces on a pretext and occupied then all of Manchuria, setting up the puppet state of Manchukuo under the last Qing emperor, Puyi. in 1932. That same year, Japan also attacked Chinese forces in Shanghai as well. And right-wing militarists in Japan assassinated the prime minister, Inukai Tsuyoshi, and other officials. So the military is really gaining a lot of influence at this time, expanding abroad and attacking politicians, elected officials, business leaders who it feels are antagonistic to its goals and to what it sees as the goals of the Japanese state at this time. The following year, Japan left the League of Nations. This was in response to the League of Nations and the Lytton Report investigating the Kwantung Army's attack on Chinese forces and the establishment of Manchukuo. Basically, the League of Nations said Manchukuo is not a legitimate state, and this finding was unacceptable to Japan, and as a result, they left the League of Nations. In 1936, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. This is against Russia, against communism, with other fascist forces at the time, Germany, Italy, and Spain. So Japan clearly aligning itself with the Axis powers and fascist forces. That same year, young right-wing military offers launched a coup. This is the February 26th incident. The coup was unsuccessful, although they probably very likely would have been successful had the emperor not stepped in and asked them to lay down their weapons. And in 1937, Japan launched full-scale war against China and against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, but also the Chinese communists as well. In 1938, Japanese Prime Minister Konoe Fumimoto enacted the National Mobilization Law, requiring everybody then to basically give everything they have to the war effort and to the state, everything they owned and all of their labor as well. In fact, human labor was an essential part of maintaining this. In 1941, Japan declared war on the US, the UK, and the Allied powers. And this would be the start of the Pacific War. Okay, now just to detail then some and just a small portion of war crimes and atrocities committed on all sides in the Asia-Pacific War. In 1935 through 1945, the top-secret Japanese Unit 731 tested chemical and biological weapons on humans. And the amount of victims of this unit, the number of victims, is unknown, but one scholar has estimated that the number is at 200,000. Sorry, there should be another zero there. In December 1937, the Japanese military, during the Battle of Nanking, went on a 6-week rampage of looting, murder, and rape. And this is referred to as the Rape of Nanking, or the Nanking Massacre now. It's estimated that between 200,000 to 300,000 were killed. War Crimes Tribunal, and these numbers come from the Tokyo trial, the trials that were held by the Allied powers after the war. And then this is from war crimes trials that were held in China after the war. So these are, of course, on the higher end of the spectrum, but they are two estimates anyway. 1938 through 1943, the Japanese indiscriminately bombed Chongqing, the nationalist headquarters at that time, and it's estimated that 10,000 were killed in this. In April 1938, the Japanese military used 40,000 poison gas shells in the Battle of Wuhan. In April 1942, the Japanese military in the Philippines force captured Filipino fighters and US and British fighters to march, and what today is known as the Bataan Death March. Many died from disease and starvation. Here, there's again, the estimates are, there's a quite wide variation between anywhere between 5,000 to 18,000 estimated killed. In March 1945, then from November 1944, the United States had began to launch air raids against the Japanese mainland. And these were essentially, well, they were indiscriminate bombings using incendiary fire bombs designed to terrorize and kill masses of civilians. And the thinking at this time was that through these terror bombings, the U.S. would be able to break Japanese morale and the will to carry on the war. This was the thinking at the time. And on March 10th, 1945, the U.S. launched one of the largest attacks against air raids against Tokyo, in which in just one night, in over 2 hours, it's estimated that over 100,000 people were killed. During the Battle of Okinawa between April and June 1945, 200,000 people, mostly civilians, Okinawan civilians, were killed. And this number includes fatalities on both sides, US and Japanese as well. In August 1945, the US dropped atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and total roughly 200,000 were killed. And this includes numbers of atomic bomb victims who died from radiation poisoning afterward. So just to look at some of the overall figures then, between 1937 and 1945, the number of war deaths stood at 14 million Chinese, 3 to 4 million Indonesians, 3 million Japanese, and 1 million Filipinos. So why did this conflict happen? Oh, sorry, getting ahead of myself. We should, first I just want to highlight some quotes describing the Nanking Massacre. And these are by, all of these quotes are by Japanese soldiers. In a military field diary of the 22nd Regiment from that time, from December 14th, 1937, stated very kind of briefly, executed 328 POWs by firing squad and buried the bodies. And this is the official field diary, one of them from the time. Another Japanese soldier, Azuma Shido, a former soldier with the 22nd Regiment, recollected that whenever we soldiers found a young Chinese woman, we would always peek at her private parts. Some soldiers would also rape women. The truly awful ones would kill the women after raping them for fear of having their crime reported. And then the operational commander for the Battle of Nanking also wrote in his diaries, this is General Nakajima Kesago. In his diaries he wrote, "As a general rule, we are not taking POWs. When the numbers are in the tens of thousands, it's impossible to fully disarm all of them. Digging a mass grave for even 7,000 to 8,000 is nevertheless a massive undertaking. Thus the plan is to execute the POWs in groups of 1 to 200. So all of these former soldiers, entire regiments and units, and the commander of the Battle of Nanking are all admitting to not taking POWs and to massacring them. Okay, so now just to look at some of the causes of the Asia-Pacific War, and these are going to be mainly focused on internal causes in Japan, but I want to identify one category of causes which I will just call societal factors. And very simply, there is a relative unfreedom in Japanese society at this time, namely, only 1 to 2% of the population could vote, and no women could vote. No women had the right to vote. So only a very small percentage of the population was represented in politics. I also want to point out the inequality and poverty of Japanese society. Most soldiers at the time, average Japanese soldiers, only had an elementary school education, and this was, incidentally, the education which most emphasized during these 4 years an emperor-centered view of Japanese history and emphasized absolute loyalty to the emperor, as well as that the military offered a prestige. It brought prestige that many people could not gain in other jobs, and it was a good, stable job. It paid well, and this attracted a lot of soldiers, especially who didn't have other work and were suffering poverty. There was a crackdown on left-wing and anti-war thought. The socialists, communists were arrested, forced to recant their views. There was a crackdown on left-wing literature, on proletariat literature, and on labor movements, etc. So basically, by the 1930s, I guess, the left was completely driven underground and essentially crushed. I also want to point to what I will then just generally call military factors. Soldiers were taught absolute loyalty through the military field manual, the Senjin-kun. It said that surrendering will bring shame to one's family, the military, and to the nation. So it emphasized not surrendering, to kill oneself before being caught, and then self-sacrifice for nation and empire. Another important point to note is that Japanese troops were in the field generally not provided with food. They were just given the number of rations that they thought they might need for the battle and had to carry those from the beginning with them. And much of the food that was later supposed to come, or in theory would come after they had set up camp somewhere in the field, just did not come, and in many times there was no even plan for that. So soldiers were essentially urged to loot, or at least left with no other choice but to loot for their food and to rob and to steal. And this led as well to many of then the atrocities, some of which we've already looked at. We can also identify political factors. Pre-1945 Japan, since Meiji, I would say, the entire politics was centered around and created on what I would call an aggressive defensive policy. And what this means is basically it was positioned in an antagonistic relationship vis-a-vis the outside world and the West. So the start, as we've already investigated, the impetus for overthrowing the Tokugawa Bakufu and the development of Japan as a modern nation state was the appearance of Western ships, was the incursion of Western ships into Japanese waters, which were originally expelled and rejected, but which later the Meiji Restorationist forces decided that, well, they have superior technology, so what we need to do is first modernize, learn from them, learn from this technology, develop Japan into a strong nation of its own right, which can not only catch up with the West, but also stand up to the West. So this thinking was present from the very beginning of Japan as a modern nation state. And I would say this is then led to continued throughout the war, and the idea, and throughout Japanese expansionism, and the idea that, well, we need to colonize, we need to take colonies in order to better secure our position in the world, to protect the Japanese homeland, etc. Excuse me. Japan was also dominated by a rich elite throughout this period. The initial Meiji leaders stayed on behind the scenes in the Gendo-in, also the House of Peers, Sumitsu-in, making political decisions. These were all members of the aristocracy appointed by the emperor into these high political positions. And then the emperor system itself. The emperor was head of state, he was head of and commander of the military. And he was sacred and inviolable according to the Meiji Constitution. So none of these are really compatible with a democratic system of rule and governance. And then we can also highlight economic factors, the growth of Japanese capital and large mega conglomerates called zaibatsu in Japanese, many of which are still around today, seeking out new markets and resources for their products abroad. Now, I want to go into just look at some other factors that are frequently given as causes or potential causes of the Asia-Pacific War. But I want to look at how, although these are popularly given as causes, I want to kind of argue against these and demonstrate how they're not plausible. And one word that was frequently used in the immediate post-war was this idea of feudalism, hoken-teki, or hoken seido. And this went hand in hand with an idea that was popular in the immediate post-war and throughout the Cold War, with the idea of modernization theory, which basically held that US-style liberal democracy and capitalism were the apogee of world history, and that there was a linear model of development to follow from so-called feudalism to capitalism. So basically, this argument was put forward not only to explain Japan's loss in the war and actions in the war, but also to kind of justify the post-war US-led order. But this is not a plausible argument. First of all, it's really still unclear what this word means as it's typically applied. And in general, Japan had a relatively developed capitalist economy in the war years and before that. So I don't see this as a plausible argument. Another idea that's frequently put forward is, well, Japan lost because of it just didn't have sufficient technology, that the US especially was far more advanced in terms of technology. Well, of course, this is undeniable, that there was a gap in material resources and technology. It wasn't always actually the case at the start of the war, in fact. But more than that, this explains Japan's defeat, but not the causes of the war. So I also don't see this as a plausible reason. And then another popular argument is that, well, this small kind of cabal of military gangsters just took over Japan and were exercising control, so the war was all their fault. But this is not really a plausible argument. Japan had elected officials throughout the war, and this also doesn't explain what Yoshimi Yoshiaki has called grassroots fascism, meaning the high levels of popular support for the war. Okay, so that's the end of today's lecture. We're going to stop here. I hope this has been helpful, and that going over the history in this way will be able to provide us with kind of a baseline understanding of the events in question as we move forward with future lectures. So thank you very much for listening, and look forward to our future talks.